Welcome back. This time, I want to address the consequences of the summit between Putin and Trump, and I must admit that I am doing it with a heavy heart. Not only Europe has the precedent of 2022 when Trump called Putin savvy and genius for his invasion of Ukraine. Not only we have the precedents of March and May, where Europe called Putin out for a meeting with Zelensky for a 30-day ceasefire that would prove that he was not sincere about peace, as if we didn't know about that, if you consider his violations of the Budapest Memo. We not only have that Europe threatened Putin with sanctions, new ones after 17 rounds of unenforced sanctions that for the years were based on affidavits and ignore basic facts, like, for instance, that Putin's oil was bought by countries like India and Turkey and then resold to Europe, like the fact that Europe never gave up on its dependence on metals, and that even the violations to exports to Russia were almost openly violated by countries like Kazakhstan, or the fact that those ridiculous installments to apply sanctions little by little only gave Russia and Iran time to build a shadow fleet. And all this time we have seen Trump parroting Moscow's demand and making concessions in advance, the art of the deal, something that Alaska has only continued, the Alaska meeting. And this not to mention the ambush to Zelensky in the White House when Trump pretended him to sign the February version of the minerals deal that would have practically turned Ukraine into a colony of the United States, a colony with no guarantees in exchange. So we are talking about the preconditions to the destabilization of Ukraine. So he could not disappear but become another Belarus. So the mineral deals could still be enforced, but without an independent Ukraine as counterpart. And the terms demanded by Putin are so humiliating that if Ukraine accepted them, it would only create the conditions again for destabilizing the country, the application of the Georgia model, and for to turn it into another Belarus, as I have mentioned before. Something for which the security guarantees conceded by Putin would not help at all, would not help Ukraine at all. Even because even if Zelensky's removal and the demilitarization of Ukraine were not part of the deal, of the final deal, the humiliating conditions would just be a precondition to turn to the application of the Georgia model. And yet we still see the media focus on symbolic details, like that if Trump cheered Putin, that he extended him a red carpet, that they were using similar ties, and but what the media is not discussing enough is that, like in the previous instances, Trump has again sided with Putin. putting his short-term interests above the interest of the United States. And all this would be laughable if it were not so tragic, because Europe has is cheering for Trump's participation, and this participation is only emboldening Putin, who, despite the poor Russian economy, it feels an incentive to raise the stakes of his Ukraine bet instead of cutting his losses before the Russian economy crumbles. And this precisely the factor. The Russian economy, I believe, what is pushing Putin to throw the kitchen sink on Pokrovsk, um, and try to, no matter what, try to get the city that logistically is very important for the Donbass. And it's precisely this appeasement Trump style, endorsed by Europe, what is raising the risk of a wider conflict, as noted by General Richard Chirev. And in a way, that is helping China's standing on the trade war, while hurting more independent countries like India or Brazil, which so far have refused to follow the Russian anti-Western lead. A few months ago, it was my hope that the election of Friedrich Merz as Chancellor of Germany would inspire a turning point in Europe, instead of this pathetic show of weakness. Uh, but it is as it is. So the point is that Ukraine, of course, is not going to stop fighting, but I'm not precisely optimistic. Remember what Putin did in Chechnya in the Second War, so he has a very clear idea of how he would manage a, Ukrainian insurgency. And on the other hand, we know what awaits Ukrainians, because if I could refer you, to make things short, to an article appeared in Foreign Affairs some time ago, that is Putin's Ukraine. So Ukraine would have no good options. And for those who are foolish enough to believe that it's better to stop the war at all cost, even if the cost is giving them 20 or 30% of Ukraine, let me remember that we are repeating history. We are repeating the history of Czechoslovakia in 1938. In both cases, we have economies that are dependent on war. Hitler's since 1936, and Putin's right now, today. So whoever believes that this war, the stopping war at all costs, is the way to stop suffering, well, you will get in. Then remember that Europe in 1938 followed the same path, only to in 1939 get a longer and bloodier war that should have not been as costly had the people in charge, like Chamberlain, had not man up and accept reality, that you cannot deal with Putin as you couldn't deal with Hitler. And for those who, let me just make a parallel. This is what Trump is proposing. It is as if Roosevelt, instead of helping England in the Battle of England against the Nazis, he would have just pushed England to make concessions. it is as disgraceful as it sounds, and the historical parallels are undeniable. So let's for a moment imagine that Europe recovers its strength and democracies man up and stop playing dead. What they can do? Number one is stop trusting Trump. How many times he have to dupe you for before you realize that you cannot rely on him? And it's sad to see Europe leaders coming to Washington as supplicants to the White House, begging favors from their king, when you already know from past experience what the result is going to be. So that stop trusting Trump implies that you have to admit that you are on your own and that the fall of Ukraine will deprive you from the number one motivator to counter the Russian threat and from the 1 million army Ukraine has that will be the buffer to counter Putin's ambitions in Eastern Europe, especially when Europe lacks seasoned soldiers who can help train Europeans to fight a possible war with Russia. That has been Merz has been trying to correct that in Germany, but as Jack Watling have noticed, Jack Watling and others, that is still far from happening in the United Kingdom. And don't come to me with, oh, well, but they have to, you have to be patient. This is part of a process. In 1940-41, FDR and Stalin adapted their economies to war in 1 year. And after almost 4 years, more than 3 years, Europe is still stumbling on their feet. They all have only issue a vague white paper, but taking not the steps that are needed for consolidation. It's a shame that they have 10 times Russian GDP and yet they cannot match Russian production of vital short-term supplies like artillery and drones. Trump has been promising sanctions against Putin, and the closest we have had so far are sanctions on India because he doesn't dare to sanction China. And all the while, the world is watching. It's for everybody to see that unless you are China, you will be treated as India. And if you don't want to be treated as India, you better accommodate to China or form blocks to counter the abuse. So that will, of course, isolate the United States even more and leave more ground for Putin to do what he has been doing in Afghanistan and Africa, that is paving the way militarily for China's economic diplomacy. And if you cannot realize that, it's because you are not following the news. Number two, stop saying idiotic things like that Putin must prove he's serious about peace. And I am quoting Starmer. He is not. What more else do you need to realize that he is not? And after more than 3 years of war, that shouldn't come to you as a surprise. The same for Mark Rutte, and the same for all people in Europe that one day will have to be made accountable if you get what Europe got after 1938 Chamberlain's appeasement. Number three, the effect of territorial concessions could be devastating on NATO's credibility and on Ukraine's morale, which would make it very easy to destabilize it because and it would not be very difficult. The narrative Putin would push inside Russia is that after more than 3 years of death and destruction, the West is pushing Ukraine to cede Crimea and to concede Crimea and the Donbass just because they don't feel like getting their act together in defense, even though they have the resources. And would that work? It worked in Georgia. It's the Georgia model. They will. Does anybody have any doubt that even as soon as a peace deal like the Putin is pursuing is signed, he would use precisely Europe's irresponsibility as an argument to destabilize Zelensky or whoever succeeds in? Well, is no, is you can is evident, and yet the leaders of Europe are pathetically look coming to the White House of courtiers, trying to seek the approval of their king. Number 4, Trump's peace deal would destroy whatever is left of NATO's credibility and lead to Ukraine's destabilization. Remember that I believe it was Asia Today that brought some declarations of Prime Minister Ishiba about precisely how could Japan trust NATO when NATO couldn't even enforce the guarantees they gave Ukraine in 1994 in the Budapest Memo when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. So how could if it's obvious that Europe is making excuses to drop Ukraine, how could, in case of a conflict with China, how could they trust the West? And it's completely legitimate. Another point is that modifying the constitution to concede the Donbass would be another slap to Ukraine's morale. You would force them to change their constitution to give the Donbass give Putin the Donbass as a trophy, and pretty much that would destroy after so much bloodshed and suffering, that would destroy any trust Ukraine may have still on Europe. And as mentioned before, precisely that would be used as narrative to destabilize the country. And to make the humiliation worse, Ukraine would have to buy 100 billions in United States weapons to obtain United States empty security guarantees no better than Budapest, because Trump has already said that he will not deploy American troops in Ukraine. He would at best give air cover. And if we follow the excuses given by this administration when it comes to weapons, even earmarked by Biden, the times they have been redirected to American stockpiles that instead of being delivered to Ukraine. So that's an empty guarantee, while Putin would get sanctions relief precisely when his economy is weak, but the validation of his existential threat narrative that has been bought by the Russians due to the ineptitude of European and American intelligence to show how ridiculous that argument is, and of course the Donbass as a trophy. But there is another argument. So the guarantees would be pretty much given by Europe, not the USA, yes, the same Europe that has came to Trump this Monday, and will be an invitation not for a new war, but for the destabilization, because we know that the Novorossiya region that includes the port of Odessa would allow Russia to dominate the Black Sea, is next in the list of next in Putin's list of targets. Number 5, there should not be a 19th round of sanctions. Put everything in this last one, as Putin is throwing the kitchen sink on the Ukrainians on Pokrovsk. Use Putin's weak economy to put maximum pressure. So it's disgraceful to see how, while Ukraine has been trying to resist massive waves of Russians, while they have been outrun and having to see their economies and their infrastructure destroyed, Europe and Biden, but basically this has been Biden's fault. They have decided to go on sanctions little by little, tiny little bit by tiny little bit. The result is that after 17 rounds of sanctions, Russia has had enough time to build a shadow fleet with at least 200 units, have been able to even find ways to bypass SWIFT, the mechanism for payments, and why not? The sanctions have been pretty much unenforced based on affidavits. And only this 18th round of sanctions are targeting more than 3 years into the war, the shadow fleet. So if Putin is throwing the kitchen sink on Ukrainians, well, at the very least, throw all the kitchen sink in one installment in terms of sanctions on the Russian economy, especially because they are weak. And why do we know that this time they are weak for real? Because the Russian central bank is pretty independent, and they have resisted Putin's pressure in the past to reduce the interest rate. This time, though, they have reduced the interest rate because for them it's clear that the Russian economy is slowing down despite all the money put by Putin in his machine war, even at the expense of their reserve fund. Number 6, stop making stupid statements in which you beg for Trump's protection or approval. You are on your own, and unless Democrats man up, you will still be on your own in 2029. It would be different if you didn't have the resources, but when you have 10 times Russia's GDP and you prefer to go little bit by little bit, without to this day having clear guidelines for consolidation of the fragmented and inefficient European defense industry, then you have to provide because you have the resources. So if you don't provide, you are making excuses. If you don't sense the sense of you don't have the sense of urgency to adapt your economy after 3 years of war, then you are making excuses. And the best example of this is the case of Pokrovsk again, where after Europe supposedly having realized that they cannot trust Trump, and then only to trust Trump again. Well, Ukrainians are still outgunned in terms of artillery. They are outmanned in terms of soldiers. They are outgunned in terms of artillery, and still you are unwilling to take the steps to increase artillery and drone production up to the task. And related to this point is that you have to start following Merz and not Trump. As mentioned before, how many times do you need to be fooled by Trump to not look like an accomplice instead of a victim? And number 7, once and for all, take the consolidation of Europe's defense industry seriously. Is depressing that so far all you have is a white paper instead of clear guidelines saying who should do that and what are you doing to plan for materials and human resources, the engineers that are going to lead that production, the resources that are needed to make that production reliable. So it's very telling the case of TNT, because explosives depend in Europe of only one factory located in Poland. The rest is imported, so they don't have control over the supplies of the explosives needed for artillery production and part of the weapon or drones production. Recently, there has been a call for more flexibility on spending, on defense spending, but this will only help waste the 800 billion euros pledged for defense faster, and all this without making Europe less dependent from the United States. As mentioned before, Ukraine is still outgunning Pokrovsk. If flexibility is required to meet those guidelines that we still don't see, well, then flexibility is a positive step. The sooner the better. Otherwise, it will be just a recipe for waste and disaster. And it's very telling that Europe still can satisfy, as mentioned before, its TNT needs to increase artillery and drone production. They are still relying only on this factory in Poland. Moreover, clear guidelines would help push before voters the right kind of flexibility before the voters get tired with yet another failed European pledge. And maybe the worst humiliation of Europe will be that as Russian economy slows down, Europe capes instead of pushing Putin's economy over the edge. So it would be, in other words, snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory. As Prime Minister Ichiba declared once, who could trust a Europe that betrays its mission in such a laughable way? And that's why I'm not particularly optimistic about the future of Ukraine, but my assessment is the same. If the weakness of Europe's leaders let Ukraine fall or cape to a humiliating defeat, it's just a matter of time before Putin uses that same betrayal to destabilize the rest of Ukraine, and then Europe will have no credibility. Your fund without the soldiers you are willing to deploy and that Ukraine has, and without the the military lab that allows you to test what works and what doesn't, which is Ukraine right now, your 800 billion euros will be just wasted or increase your dependence on the United States. And all this precisely when the United States is led by Donald Trump. And the Democrats have forgotten completely the legacy of FDR, Roosevelt, the president who created the rules-based system. They have also neglected, and the leader who used every trick in the book to help England, while Democrats only want to dump Ukraine in where they don't have to remember about them. So, and voters are not going to connect the dots by themselves. I must admit that I am very disappointed in the people in the Ukrainian, with one exception, Irina Zuckerman. But I am very disappointed with the Ukrainian community because some time ago I tried to promote 9 questions that should pressure the media to focus on what matters and not in the color of the ties, the color of the carpet, or whether Trump cheered Putin or not, or details that are nonsensical. And yet we are here again committing the same mistakes in such a short time, while Ukrainians are being pushed more and more over the edge. And the problem is not too sad for Ukraine, but it's not our war, like Marco Rubio said, showing brutal ignorance. But the problem is that involved in Putin would expand the model of the Sahel to the rest of Africa, in Afghanistan, to the Middle East, and try to be the privateer of China, as China expands their economic and political model to the rest of the world. And when a country is faced before the dilemma, who should you trust, they will remember Ukraine and they will accommodate, but not to the West, because nobody could be that stupid. So remember Finland and Stalin, the term Finlandization. Well, get used to that. And when the United States need rare earth or any other thing, they will see that their influence has been shrunk by unfulfilled pledges, by short-sighted, irresponsible decisions, and by Europe's cowardice. And having said that, thank you.
And now, an important message from the Democratic Party.
I raise a point of order against page 1, lines 3 to 5 of the pending amendment, which violates Section 313B1A of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974.
The point of order is sustained. The text will be stricken.